Hello, and welcome to the Unnamed Game Co's Worldbuilding series, Episode 1. What is it? What is world building anyway? Well, before we can start talking about that, we need to talk about, who am I? My name is Ceridwen. I use they, them pronouns, and I've been running homebrew campaigns since about 2010, and yeah, I'm old. Anyway, so I went to college for English. My focus was in literary criticism, and I am now the co-creator for Unnamed Game Co, which mostly means that I just rein Gilbert in, at least when I can. I also do the layouts for most of our games. And in general, I am an avid gamer. I like playing games, I like running games, I like some video games, mostly just Fallout if we're honest. But I love going to conventions. I wrote and delivered several Game Master workshops at Gen Con from 2015 to 2019. I did world building, NPC building, plot building, and the world building is without a doubt my favorite of those. So, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about the series that we're doing here. The purpose of this series is to look at world building for role-playing games, not for books, not for movies. We want to look specifically at how world building is defined in reference to tabletop role-playing games, because it is different. When you're writing a book, you have control over the characters. You know where they are, and you get to decide what they're doing, and you can retcon and change things whenever you want. And that's very different from world building for a tabletop role-playing game, where you have to build the whole world and then hand it over to these players and let them explore it and change it. Players have to be able to affect the world in a role-playing game, and you as the game master can guide and direct and suggest, but you can't control how the story is going to go. And rather than trying to control it and doing the railroading thing, a really good world is going to help you as a game master support collaborative storytelling. So we want to first define world building. That's the big challenge of this first episode, and we're not going to get a perfect definition, but we'll start getting in a direction. And then later on, we're going to identify multiple methods of world building, and I will demonstrate some of them and give you an idea of what it looks like when you build a world from that direction. And I invite you to join me in this adventure. Even if you've been doing world building and running games for decades, sometimes just coming at it from a different angle will really change your perspective. And it helps you grow as a game master, even if you've been doing it for a really long time. I learn something new every time I build a new world, because I am constantly absorbing knowledge and information. And we're going to talk a lot about the relationship between world building and collaborative storytelling. And that's kind of what I was getting at with world building for tabletop role-playing games is just different, because you have to build this foundation for what will be a collaborative work. At least if it's in my opinion, a good game. It's going to have that collaborative aspect to it. So before we go into the meat of world building, I just want to cover some general terms that I will be using a lot. The first one, you probably already know, it's game master, right? If you don't know what a game master is, you're going to have a bad time with this series. So Game Master is the person who organizes and oversees a role-playing game, in particular by narrating the details of the story that are not controlled by the players. I have some problems with this definition, but before I get into them, there are some other things that a Game Master can be called. They are often called a GM. Old school Dungeons & Dragons players will call them the Dungeon Master or the DM. And a lot of new systems will call them storyteller or director, or just come up with their own unique way to refer to the game master. But game master is a fairly universal term that most people will recognize. So let's talk briefly about my displeasure with parts of this definition. The game master does not have to organize the role-playing game. They don't have to be the one who does the scheduling and figure out who's ordering the pizza. Like, the game master doesn't have to do that. The game master doesn't have to be the host. And in a lot of ways, it's helpful when somebody else takes that on, because the game master is invariably putting in the most hours of prep for this game. They are already lifting a lot of work to make this fun happen. So, if you're a player who really likes spreadsheets and calendars, feel free to offer to your game master. Say, I will take care of our scheduling. I will figure out where we are playing. I'll figure out the food situation. And that'll help alleviate some of that pressure from the game master if they want to, have someone else take care of that. The second piece that I'm not a huge fan of is that are not controlled by the players. So that is a point of contention for me, because as the game master, I'm not narrating something that doesn't have importance to the character. If I am describing it, it is something that the players do have control over. Unless I'm like talking about the weather or a natural disaster or something. Most of the time when I'm describing something, it is something that the players are interacting with, something that the players are going to do something with. And sometimes I describe things that players do, particularly if they have a role, like say, Russ shoots an arrow at the dragon's butt, and Russ does not hit the armor class. And then I describe, okay, well, you do this, and this is the result, right? I'm not just going to say, oh, you miss. Like that's something that some game masters do, but that's not how I describe it. I'm narrating, you loose the arrow, it flies through the darkness, it hits the scales, and it skids right off of it. Like that is describing something that is kind of controlled by the player, because the player is the one who rolled the die. Anyway, so I think that the definition would be better if they just stopped with "in particular" by narrating the details of the story. But I will also point out, in a lot of modern games, players are taking on more of that descriptive task. There are a lot of systems now, like Powered by the Apocalypse, for example, where the players are describing things, the players are doing active world building, the players are narrating, and a lot of game masters will, ask the player, well, how do you do that? What does it look like when you do that? And that sort of sharing of the description is becoming more common. And that's not a bad thing, but it's definitely something that this definition sort of fails to capture. Another term that is very, very important to world building is this concept of logical conclusions. And I'm going to sit on this definition for a while, because the foundation of your world is going to be vital to how your world works when you are running the game. If you build your world using logic and reason, that's going to make your life so much easier. One of the comments that I commonly get from players and other game masters when they experience my style of running is that, oh, it's so big. There's so much. How do you keep track of it all? And the trick for me is that it all makes sense. There's a game that I like to play where I have somebody ask me a question about my world, and then I give them an answer. And they have to try and guess, is that something that existed before, or did I make it up on the fly? I am super good at that game, because I have really firm, solid logic and reason within my world, so that when somebody throws something at me, I can usually come up with something that makes sense, that sounds right, even if I've never thought about it before. Because I have these rules in place, I can work within them and build out from them. These foundations of logic are super important to being able to be flexible. And it sounds contradictory that you would have to establish rules in order to be flexible. But if you have logic and rules, then your players will experience the world within the confines of those logical rules. That means that the things that they are coming up with, the things that they are creating, the story that they are enjoying fits within that logic, and it makes sense. And this is a super, super powerful tool, having that internal logic. And it doesn't have to match with the logic of our real world. You can totally just skip over gravity if you want. You don't have to stick within the bounds of the real world. But by having your own set of logic, you have that great, fantastic tool to use to rely on, which is going to help you when you're thinking on the fly. And also, it gives you the opportunity to break the logic. And it gives you the chance to really entice people with that abnormality. So if you have a world where everything super makes sense and suddenly something doesn't, that will inspire them. That will get their attention. So let's do a little demonstration of that. So the logical conclusion means if X, then Y. So if the king dies, the prince becomes king. In this setting, there's a patriarchy, it's a monarchy. So if the king dies, the prince becomes king. But what if the prince is missing? Then what? We've established this logic, this reason, this clear-cut definition of here, if X, then Y, and then we break it. What if the prince is missing? You don't have to railroad your characters if they're interested. So if you have an immutable law of reality and suddenly it doesn't work, that is interesting. And all of this is leading up to the most important thing in world building, and that is internal consistency. That is the target. If you can make things make sense in your world, then everything else falls into place. You can use your internal consistency to take care of all of the little details that you will never be able to remember. Your internal consistency covers the bases, and it gives your players a really good starting point. Because if everything in your world is internally consistent, then they know the rules. They know what risks they can take and what risks they shouldn't, and they can understand what the consequences are going to be so that they can make educated decisions about how they want to move forward with the story. Internal consistency helps to ease back that railroading and start giving players more agency because they will be more confident with how their character interacts with the world. And it builds so much confidence when a player can go, oh, this must be this because of that. And they feel so powerful when they start to understand. And that is exciting. It's engaging. And it's really rewarding as a game master to see your players put things together. And internal consistency is what gives the players the power to do that. And if you've been running a game long enough, your players will start to put things into the world for you. And they will be sensible. They will be consistent. They will make sense. And your players will start really doing the collaboration on this storytelling. And sometimes they come up with ideas that are even cooler than what you were planning. And that's the trope that you see where the game master who's been playing long enough, they're like, yeah, that vampire coven, takes note to add vampire coven to next combat, right? Because the players are generating story, and it becomes this self-perpetuating thing where it's a call and response, it's a conversation, it's a freaking symphony. It's gorgeous. If you have that internal consistency, you are giving that amazing power to shape the world to the players. And it's the chef kiss of GMing for me. I love building internally consistent worlds. I love playing in internally consistent worlds. And that's going to be a recurring focus as I go through this series, is talking about how we can make these worlds that are designed to be explored and to be built and to be used for collaborative storytelling. And so I've done a lot of talking, which GMs do, but we haven't gotten to that definition of what is world building. We've defined the game master, we've talked about logical conclusions, we've talked about internal consistency, but what is world building? There's a article by Merriam-Webster called What is World Building and How Do You Spell It? And they define it as the art of creating a new fictional world. And at its core, that is what world building is, right? It's the art of creating a new fictional world. And I like this definition. I like it a lot because it uses the word art. There is artistry to world building. And you may be sitting there saying like, well, it's not art. I'm just like gonna make some dragons for my friends to kill. But that is art. Because art is engaging with perspectives, it's about emotion, even if that emotion is just enjoyment. You know, that's a form of artistic expression. So the world building definition here is very general and it's pretty accurate, I think. But what we want to define is what is world building for tabletop role-playing games in particular. Moreover, what is good world building? Because world building just by itself is, fine. But we want good world building. So before we can define what world building is, we need to think about what we want to get from our world building. What kind of world are we building? Why are we building it? And how is this world going to get me the game that I want? And I recommend coming up with a game objective. And these are the 3 questions that I put at the core of my worlds. What do I hope to get out of this game? Why do I want to run it? And what do I want my players to get from it? Because world building is a lot of work. Running a game, a lot of work. And if you just want to run a game and you don't want to build a world, there are tons of fantastic mods out there. You can just pick up a module game, run it. You don't have to put the time and the energy into the world building if that's not what you're into. But if you are building a world, you really should explore why. And that core is going to be where your logical conclusions come from. It's going to be at the heart of your consistency. So let's look at 2 possible examples. The first one, I want to explore this awesome world that I made up. I need a creative outlet and I want to have fun. And I want my players to feel like they're on a grand adventure. That is a really good start. I'm immediately thinking like Brendan Fraser's The Mummy. I'm thinking jet setting. I'm thinking Indiana Jones, or maybe I'm thinking like a Bond film where we're going to Milan and Venice. Maybe I want to run a fantasy spy game. I'm thinking about a world that has lots of places. I'm thinking about a world with reasons to go to those places. Are we hunting for ancient artifacts? Are we trying to stop an international incident? Why are my players going to move? And having that as the core of my world means that I have some structure to start hanging these world building pieces from, where I want to build a world that people will explore. I want to build a world full of adventures and grandioseness. That's a pretty cool set. But let's look at an alternative answer. Let's say I just want to hang out with my buds. I want everyone to have a really good time. And I want my players to laugh. I just want this to be like a fun, carefree joke kind of game. And that's valid. You don't have to write the Silmarillion to have a good time with a tabletop role-playing game, you know? There are people who do just enjoy hanging out with their friends and rolling some dice, and maybe they don't want to have a deep, heartfelt conversation with somebody. Maybe they do just want to joke and have fun. And that's not a bad thing. Games are supposed to be fun. It's just people have different ways of having that fun. So if I'm running a game where I want people to just have a lot of fun and have a lot of laughs, I want to build a world that's going to support that. I want to build a world that's full of fun, funny stuff, like a gnome Disney world where the gnomes have built golems for the animatronics, and the golems are on strike. And that's what the world is, you know? And I'm going to put in all of this stuff that's going to have pies and whoopee cushions, and there will be clowns, kobold clowns. Right? So this world is going to be fun. It's going to be lolsy. And that's so different from the other world. So how do we get there? Well, let's look at these side by side. We ask the same question. I want to explore this awesome world. I want to hang out with my friends. These are different, right? The goal is different. The game master wants something different. And that's a really important distinction, because part of what you're doing when you're making your world is you are coming up with the expectations. You are setting the groundwork so that players who are joining your game have an understanding of what they're getting into. If you have an action adventure movie where, you know, the players are going to be jet setting and finding ancient artifacts, and somebody shows up and they want to play a lulzy, you know, slapstick game, that's different. Those are different expectations. And if you can have this core of your world that's like, no, this is what I want from the game, you can express that to people. You can build a world that's going to support that so that players understand what the world is supposed to be. And why? Why are you doing this world, right? I need a creative outlet versus I want everyone to have a really good time. My creative outlet game is going to spend a lot more time figuring out the biomes of this world, figuring out the wildlife, the flora, and the fauna, versus my really fun game where I'm going to spend a lot of time figuring out traps and gags and funny monsters and puns. So my energy in world building is going to be spent on different things depending on the purpose for that world building. And ultimately, what do you hope your players will get out of playing? Because this is why we build worlds. We run games and we build worlds because we want to share them. We want other people to experience them. What you want from your players is just as important as what you want from your game. Because your players are going to be telling this story with you. So having a clear vision of the experience that you want someone to have is going to help you execute it and lay into the foundation the tools necessary to accomplish your goals. So how do we define world building with reference to tabletop role-playing games? Well, world building is creating a fictional world with internally consistent logic to allow for the kind of gameplay that I want in my campaign. I feel like that's a more complete definition with a focus on what the tabletop role-playing game needs. It needs a foundation that's going to help you achieve your objectives and help you find what you want out of running this world. So that brings us to a decent definition, I think, so we can conclude the episode. Next episode, we're going to take this definition and start trying to apply it. And we'll start thinking about some of the different ways that world building can be done. And I'll try and give you an example, and we'll see how that goes. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you subscribe, you can, follow along with the next ones. Give us a little thumbs up, and it helps somehow. I don't know. I don't do YouTube or social media or anything. But I would also really love comments, because discourse is what drives me. I love asking questions and answering questions. So leave comments if you liked it, if you hate it, if you have questions, if you just want to compliment my beautiful speaking voice. I'll take whatever you got, right? Just interact with me. Give me the illusion of human connection through the internet. But yeah, and this is the official end of the episode, but I'm going to, at the end of each episode, talk about my world. So, welcome to the Cascadon Corner. This is where I will talk briefly about my world, my baby, my Cascadon. Back in 2009, entering 2010, I started getting this idea for a world. And I was working in a call center in 2010, and my coworker Cindy was reading these just god-awful romance novels about dragons. But I've when it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you will read literally anything. So I started reading these books, and it got me thinking about how I would do it better. At this point, I had only ever run Buffy the Vampire Slayer tabletop role-playing game set in Cleveland, where there's another Hellmouth. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I wanted to run a fantasy game. And I was thinking about what I would do, the story that I would tell. And it started with this idea of a prince who got injured in battle and got rescued by a dragon. But the dragon was in human form, and she had a son, and he was helping to raise the son and learning her language and falling in love, typical romance novel stuff. But then I started asking what-if questions and finding some logical conclusions. And I asked the question of myself, well, if the prince is out here banging a dragon, who's in charge? And what if the king is dead? What if the prince has a brother? Yeah, he's got a brother who nobody likes. Why don't people like him? And these questions just started cascading. And eventually I needed a name for this thing that I was thinking about, this kingdom, this place, this story that I was telling. And I came up with Cascadon. And I Googled it, and it doesn't already exist. And I was like, cool, that's the name. It's Cascadon. And somehow this stupid little dragon romance story evolved into a 12-year campaign that I've been running in my head. I have 21 deities. I have 9 baronies. I have 8 countries on an island, which I have geological histories of breaking away from this Pangea-like continent elsewhere. I have dragon lore. I have I have art history from this kingdom, from the last 5 kings. I have all of this stuff that has built up and blossomed out of this process of just thinking, well, what if? And coming up with interesting things. And I mean, it's huge. It's huge. And I don't remember everything that I've ever come up with. But the things that really matter, the core of Cascadon, always goes back to my objectives. And what do I hope to get out of the game? I want to feel awesome. I love the feeling of just feeling like I've done something cool. That's why I run games, because it's the best opportunity to feel like a badass that a fat nerd can have, right? So why do I want to run the game? Because I need an audience, right? I need people to interact with me. I need co-conspirators. I need surprises. I need people to take this cool toy that I've made and configure it in a way that I never thought of before. I crave that interaction. And what do I hope my players get out of it? I want my players to also feel awesome. I love building people up. I love giving people the opportunity to feel great things. And sometimes they are awesome and terrifying things. Sometimes they are just extreme sorrow. Like sometimes it's elation. Sometimes it's relief. Sometimes it's utter bafflement. Sometimes it is being scared shitless. But those kinds of feelings, that intensity, that drives me. I love when I make players have big feelings. And I love when they come out of an encounter or a challenge and they're like, oh my God, that was so awesome when you did that thing. Or, oh man, that thing that you said to that bad guy that was so cool. Like, I love that. I love being able to give people the opportunity to feel awesome, because that makes me feel awesome. And that's why I call my game Legends of Cascadon, because it's a game about people who aren't quite legends yet. So that's your little trip to the Cascadon corner. You will get some more little tidbits about my world as we go through, and I will discuss in my next episode how I did some of my world building on a more specific level. So thanks again for listening. Bye.